Thank you for joining us for the ongoing RTS webinar series. Today's topic, as you know from the email invite, is systems intelligence, how to run and scale your business more effectively. And as I mentioned, this is an ongoing series. All our past webinars are available on our website at resultstthroughstrategy.com. Just go to the tab that talks about webinars, and you'll be able to access any of the material that we have there. So for today's discussion, we do have some esteemed panelists. First and foremost, I'm happy to introduce you to David Cantu. He's one of the co-founders of Hot Schedules, who started there as a young man, and he's getting to middle age, but we're happy to have him here. And then I also have Alex Birnbaum, who's our technologist at Results Through Strategy. So David, why don't you just give a little bit of a background on who you are, and then we'll get into Alex.
Thank you, and I'd still like to think of myself as young, so I appreciate that, Fred, middle age. I am David Cantu. I am out of Austin, Texas. I've been in the restaurant industry for about 30 years, half actually working in restaurants and half serving through technology. And it's a pleasure to be here. I appreciate joining your panel.
Great. Alex.
So I am Alex Birnbaum. I am partner with Results Through Strategy, focusing on technology. And I have been with RTS for almost 4 years now. And prior to that, about 20 years in the restaurant industry, doing various technology and operational roles, most recently with Craftworks Restaurants from 2011 to 2014.
So today's structure, we're going to sort of cover what is systems intelligence, go into some of the challenges that exist in operating a restaurant company, and then talk about potential solutions here. So first off, systems intelligence, and this is a phrase that not a lot of people understand. We've heard about, emotional intelligence, which is EQ, IQ, which is just basic, competence and cognitive thinking. But systems intelligence is a different way of thinking and viewing the world. So if you stop and think about it, all business models are based on a series of defined processes and procedures. And generally, we're going to get into the specific functions that they're focused within. But the important thing to note is that they need to exist independently and interdependently. And this is where it gets interesting. So the model is, instead of EQ or IQ, is SYQ. That's your systems intelligence. And the CEOs who really grasp this, as well as other staff members, are the ones that can be the most effective in making an organization function more seamlessly and not get themselves into any specific areas of trouble and difficulty. So the functions that we look at in systems intelligence are as follows. Now, this may not be all-inclusive. For example, we did not include franchising in here. If you're a franchise company, that would go into it. But essentially, we're looking at these functions and sort of what their purpose is. So starting with the people and human resources, attract, train, and retain top talent, moving to technology, and so forth and so on. I'll let you read it. You're going to get a copy of this anyway, so be able to see it on your own. So if you look at those 8 functions there, and then look at this potential structure for the business functions, what you'll see is that human resources, technology, finance, and administration are the infrastructure functions. They're the ones that cross the entire boundaries of the organization, where operations, development, food and beverage, branding, and marketing exist not so much siloed, but definitely exist on top of this infrastructure. So the cross-functional nature of these various models are important. And so let me show you this graphic. So this is sort of a little bit of understanding of what systems intelligence is. It's the ability to see the interrelationship in the workflow processes. And workflow is something we're going to get into very specifically. And as I mentioned at the beginning, they have to work independently and work within unison organization. So you can see that typically the outer rings where a lot of people sort of see the connection, but they miss the inner connection points where the cross-functional nature really happens. And where companies get into trouble is they fail to look at each one of these functions to make sure that it does have a strong focus and standardization within itself, and then understands the interdependence and interrelationship and unison that they have to have within the rest of the organization. So what I'd like to do is to make sure that we have a chance to understand some of the foundational elements of this. So I'm going to ask David to talk a little bit more about what workflows are so you can begin to get a sense of it. So David.
So specific to the workflows, and as we look at, the benefit that we've had is that we have Manager's Red Book in our portfolio, and it was probably one of the first of the mobile devices in the industry that was started in the late 80s. For those of you who remember, a lot of communications go on it, a lot of task lists. We're in about 90,000 restaurants. What we learned from those books and from the different operations as this became part of our portfolio, it was many of these organizations were focused on, brand standards and creating consistency across the brand as they expanded and grew. And they developed these very detailed processes and checklists, which led to workflows. As we look at the workflow, our focus is on the day in the life or the journey path of a manager throughout the day, and pulling all those various tasks together on one platform, whether they come in from third-party applications or if they're created from above store from your marketing team or your ops or finance or HR. We think about workflow as the journey path of a manager and everything that they have to interact with.
And so we're going to give some examples of workflow later on, but workflow is just a foundational piece of understanding how each function does function interdependently. But then when you look at the holistic view, then we get into the systems intelligence piece. And systems intelligence does require systems thinking. So Alex, why don't you explain a little bit about what systems thinking entails?
So systems thinking is really, it's the final component of the fifth discipline, the seminal Peter Senge work from 1990. And the fifth discipline, for just a brief review, the four disciplines that go before systems thinking is personal mastery, mental models, building a shared vision, and team learning. And we're not going to touch on those today, but systems thinking is really the final piece of that brings those four together. And systems thinking is more of a conceptual way to think about things. Basically anything that shapes the conditions or behavior. And so since everything is a system, to have high systems intelligence, it requires us to use systems thinking to get there. And there's a couple of different ways that can break down, but I like to think about them as people with high systems intelligence are inquisitive. They're typically asking, as Simon Sinek so aptly says, they start with why. Why is this happening? Low systems intelligence jumps right to the end, the let's propose solutions. And really, in order to have high systems intelligence and use systems thinking, we need to start with the why is it happening.
Yeah, in Peter Senge's book, he gives a great example of a system, and that's for all of us on this call, probably we travel quite a bit. You get into a hotel room, you're going to take a shower. And at home, we can flip that shower on and know exactly where to put it, where the temperature is going to be perfect. You step right in literally without touching the water. You can't do that in a hotel. In a hotel, it's a whole different story. And part of the system is not just the movement of the faucet to change the temperature, but it's the time delay in the system for the change to be noticed. And it's all this tweaking that goes on. When I talk to CEOs of companies and I say to them, have you ever made a decision for something that's going to improve operations in the field? And when you get to the restaurants, the exact opposite of what you wanted is occurring. And many times they say, of course, it happens a lot. And I said, part of it is, have you quantified how long it takes for a change to occur through your company? Because that time delay sometimes makes people make bad mistakes. They make a decision, they go out there 3 days later, expect it to be implemented. They may find out it takes 5 days, and they make another decision. And then 2 days later, the initial change comes in, but then 5 days later, another change comes through. And that's what systems thinking has to do, is understand the interdependence between all these systems. Another great book besides The Fifth Discipline by Peter Senge is John Mackey's book, Conscious Capitalism. And he talks about systems thinkers. Conscious leaders are natural systems thinkers, because if you look at the conscious capitalism model, they say there's a higher purpose, there's a stakeholder mentality where everybody wins, including your vendors, not just you, not just your employees, not just your shareholders, but all stakeholders, the community and your guests, a conscious leader, and then a conscious culture. And when you consider a business from this standpoint, it forces you to become a system thinker, and that's a big piece of what is important. So part of the inquiry here then is, how does this really get down to the restaurants? What really occurs at a restaurant level that's going to make a difference? So David, why don't you walk us through a little bit about some of the challenges you have as an operator? You started as an operator as I did, and Alex, and these are some of the real things that happen in the life of a restaurant manager.
Yeah, today, as we all know, competition is greater than it's ever been. The share of food dollar is continuing to be more favorable to the restaurant industry. The complexity has become increasingly difficult, and I have additional information on this in upcoming slides. But we work with a lot of brands, and a lot of brands we've seen a lot of acquisitions. When these acquisitions or the consolidation starts to occur, then you start to see multiple point of sale systems, multiple back office systems, and that therein becomes the challenge of trying to obviously run an operation and running multiple systems across the board. As we know, there's been significant infusion of private equity dollars based on the boom that we've seen in the restaurant industry over the past 8-9 years. This has led to rapid growth. And also just the many disparate systems has also made it very difficult for anyone at the store level, and in some cases at above store, to really disseminate information and how it impacts, various parts of the organization. We've seen lack of consistency with the rapid growth. This kind of goes back to, brand standards, managers doing the things they need to do, not the things they kind of get pulled into. It takes, discipline and follow through, and it takes a level of accountability, and that has become increasingly challenged as we've seen the industry evolve.
Well, all these things that David's been talking about are some of the big challenges. And then companies want to make changes. And sometimes the changes are easier to talk about and much more difficult to do. In our experience, anything that requires a behavior change is very, very difficult to implement. So I'm going to ask Alice to talk a little bit about how change does occur.
There's really two different buckets that I like to look at change. There's the hard to control piece that you can't. All you can do is plan for it, but you have no idea when it's coming. And so that's basically, if something is going to disturb you from outside, that's intervention from an external force. Something changes in the environment around you. That could be a shift in your it could be a shift in your trade area. It could be a shift in the physical, plans of your restaurant. Something, a hurricane happens or something like that. You have stuff that's hard to control from within the system. Someone leaves. A key management team member leaves your organization. It could be the internal change of a relationship. You move from one mainline supplier to another. Those are things that you sometimes have to just deal with the change that comes up and accept it. Then there's controlled changes. These are easier to plan but harder to implement, and they require intentional conscious change, which means planning, working through the scenarios, figuring out your project plan, and then also communicating with everyone else who's involved in the change, and that's the cross-functional portion of how we manage change.
Well, thank you, Alex. And I want to remind the audience that if you have any questions, if you go to the right-hand side of your screen, where that little floating tab is for GoToWebinar, you're able to pop in some questions there. We'll try and answer them in real time as this allows us. So we've talked a little bit about what the definitions of systems thinking is, systems intelligence, as well as some of the real life situations that occur within businesses. So the next thing is sort of what are the solutions? What is it that we can try and do? And as we look at it, technology has a lot to do with it, because technology can help us automate a lot of these processes. It helps us keep critical tasks front and center. As David likes to say, all of us fall into the trap of doing what we like to do rather than what we need to do. And we want to make it sort of simple for people to follow the process so they actually get much more efficient and don't have to worry about remembering. I fly a lot, and I'm really happy that pilots use the checklist. I don't want to be on a flight the day a pilot decides not to use the checklist. Because whether you've been flying for 10 years or 30 years, that checklist is important, and it includes everything for a reason. And these are the things that we're mindful of. So here's an example of a workflow process for onboarding. And I'll leave it up here for a second so you kind of get a sense to see how on the left-hand side, it sort of tells you sort of what's the stage of what's going on in terms of their future employee, their pre-hire, they're being onboarded, their start week, and so forth and so on. And then you go through within each time constraint or time measure there, and they show the kind of things that go on that's taking place. And so this is an example of how you would map out a workflow for each one of your functions. This is just one aspect of HR in terms of getting an employee to get on board. Once you start talking about now when they're an employee, the workflow may be additive to whatever we're doing here. And this is what gets complex, because not only is the workflow critical to have within its own function, but now things are needed outside of other departments in order for these people to be able to do their job once they actually take their role. So David, let's walk through a little bit about how you see this complexity in today's world.
I take myself back to, the last time I was actually in running restaurants was 2006. And, I think about the things that I love to do in running restaurants. And I think most restaurateurs are promoted from within. So either they were on the serving side, or they were on the production side, or they were, making great food. So the things that most managers that grow up in this industry and work their way up, they love to serve. They love to add value, taking care of, their guest. They love to ensure that it's the best experience, and not only the guests, but their team members. As you think about all the changes that have occurred, just the consumers have changed, the workforce has changed, and the emergence of technologies has changed. That manager is the center of the universe of all of that change. And, this has led to unprecedented turnover. We've always known that it's been a high turnover industry specific to the hourly team members, as many will call it a transient industry where it's maybe your first job. Today, the reason why it's more complex than ever is, we're having a great bit of success with the economy, which has led to low unemployment. It's running about 3.9% right now, sub 3% in many cities. With manager turnover today, limited service restaurants are seeing as much as 60% turnover. That's around the average right now. Full service restaurants are seeing about 37% turnover. Every manager turned over is about $13,000 on trying to find a new manager. However, there's a shortage of managers. Based on a study done by TDN2K, with a polling of all restaurants, 48% of restaurants were hiring front of the house managers, were short-staffed front of the house managers. 53% were hiring for back of the house managers that they were short-staffed. So it's created a lot of complexity. Obviously, the center of the universe, for a restaurant and a restaurant success resides in that GM and managers. If you go to the next slide, I want to talk about the emergence of technologies. Thinking about, the workflow and everything that happens. If you go to the next slide, the emergence of technology in the industry today, I think about from the 90s when I was managing restaurants into the early 2000s, there was only a handful of technologies. Most restaurants, worked with a point of sale system. They may have worked with, a back office solution that had inventory and labor. If you were in a bigger restaurant, not many in the small restaurants, but with the emergence of software as a service, we've really seen this scale and grow. And if you think about today, if you go to the next slide, this has created somewhat tech bloat. We evaluate, the tech stacks from a lot of our customers. We've polled a lot of them from our customer advisory boards to user conferences. A lot of these restaurants, on the full service side, we're seeing as upwards of 30 to 40 technology systems that are in their restaurants today. The outside of the ring, this was done by Tech Table, is everything that is, a guest, touching the guest or a guest experience. And everything in the center in blue is centered around operations and systems. As many want to be innovative, the challenge that we're seeing is many are providing a lot of technologies that are impacting the hourly manager. If you go to the next slide, if you think about all the complexities of what's going on, in order to be successful in a restaurant, it does take discipline and consistency. There are 1,000 things that managers need to do in order to ensure they're running the perfect shift. This is just an example of some of those tasks. We've seen some operations have as many as 800 tasks in a day that need to be completed based on the checklist that we have in managers' red books. So some to a high level of extreme. If these things aren't done, things are missed, like line checks, which could lead to, a foodborne illness from improper storage. And we know that the result of social media today, how that can impact a brand significantly in their value. As we think about that complexity, Fred, I mean, that's led us to, where we wanted to go as a company beyond the scheduling.
No, and this is a good point. If you think about what happened to Chipotle, which is the great example, unfortunately, for them in terms of a failure to have a system scale and adapt to growth and the complexities of an operation once it gets past a certain size. I always tell our clients that growth is arithmetic, but complexity is exponential. And that's where, these lists are really, really important. But think about poor managers today. They have to be a computer specialist, an HR specialist, a plumber, an electrician, a chef. I mean, they got to do a lot of different things, and it's not an easy job. And as this turnover that we've accepted in our industry being very high as a normal state has got to change. We've got to get turnover down to a level where we're keeping people for the long term, and not just because wages are going up and things like that put pressure on us. And let's face it, if you're an hourly employee and now you're making $15 an hour, which an owner might be aghast at having to pay that, but for them, that's how they live. And that's the challenge. And that's why we're getting into the world of robotics in restaurants. It's going to start changing more and more. So let's talk about how we can get this under control using technology, because I think that's really part of what we're trying to accomplish here. So David,
as we think about the intelligence, it's a lot of great managers that have long tenured are in restaurants for multiple years at a time. They're seasoned. They know when things are going to occur. It takes a few mistakes to understand from year to year. So with that, we have to have some level of workflow that helps streamlines the day to day. And when we think about workflow, it is some of that task management that needs to be accomplished, but it's also pulling in additional data sources. Specific to those data sources, they're going back to the 10 to 40 different systems. Think about the turnover of 37 to 60% turnover in managers. A new manager onboarding, as they're running the shift their first time outside of training, there are a lot of independent systems that aren't interdependent are working with others, and it becomes increasingly difficult to know how to access them and where to manage them. When we think about the workflow, we think about when managers need to be doing certain things throughout the day, even if it's weaving in those third-party applications into that stream.
Part of what gets into this, David, is that since the beginning of time, knowledge used to double every 100 years. And that's been quantified. And then after World War II, it started doubling every 25 years. Now its knowledge is doubling every 12 months. And McKinsey did a report that said once the Internet of Things rolls out, the amount of knowledge and information in the world is going to double every 12 hours. By the way, that's why none of us can keep our inboxes empty on our email account, because we're just overwhelmed with a tsunami of data, but we're starving for knowledge and information. And that's part of what we're trying to resolve here in terms of understanding how a system works. So David, walk us through a little bit about how you've tried to organize it at Hot Schedule through your Clarify program.
So we took a different approach. While we've been known for scheduling and labor management about 5 years ago, we consolidated and brought in an enterprise back office solution known as Macromatics, as well as the manager's Red Book, and many know Skooks, the learning management. While those were part of our portfolio, the disparate systems were the challenge. Us building a platform allowed us to interconnect and make these products interdependent, but we also started building off that platform from the ground up. We thought of the build being very modular and formed to where, our customers could take on what product they wanted to. And if they didn't, we would still be able to interweave other products to be a part of a workflow to where it's just one organized system that helps you manage everything. But with that platform, it allowed us to really integrate into third-party applications. It was our vision of creating an intelligent back office to where it wasn't just reliant solely on the point of sale or the purchases from the wholesale vendor. We wanted to go beyond that of things that could also impact the business. through that, we built out a workflow, and that workflow is very much, it's 3 types where it's custom task lists that can be, done specific to certain days. So, what I do on Monday is very different than what I have to do, and the things that are important on Tuesday. We interwove those products of our own, those modules, if you will, and then we provided external links to where, if I needed to go and review payroll, or if I needed to go review a third-party application that had applicants that I needed to review to determine I'm hiring, you could see on that third arrow, that's where we pulled in third-party applications in that workflow. So a manager knew exactly going through that workflow was everything they needed to accomplish for the day.
Oh, that's fantastic. And so this is an example now of what's happening with technology, right? And systems intelligence allows you to understand that symbiotic relation between people, data, strategy, and architecture, so that managers can learn to do this. Now, we recognize that generationally there's maybe some challenges. Boomers, in our experience, have a hard time sometimes adapting to the new technology because they're not comfortable with it. And quite honestly, part of it is because the technology, this first iteration, was difficult to use. But now it's getting much more intuitive and easier to use. And the model for that, of course, is your smartphone. As people have become more comfortable with the use of smartphones, ATM machines, kiosks, they now have an understanding of how sort of your UI works, your user interface works, and what you can try and do. But nevertheless, it's not easy. So here's a good example of sort of what we expect from people to achieve, and then what are the complexities there. So David or Alex, if you want to comment on this, that'd be great.
Alex, you can speak to the complex tech landscape better than I can, because I'm sure you're in the depths of that right now.
Absolutely, thank you, David. Well, there's just every day there's a new system that restaurateurs are looking to operate. We deal with a lot of different brands in a lot of different spaces. And, I can't say that there's a single client that I've worked with in the last 2 years where they weren't using one or two systems that were relatively new to the market and needed to integrate with everything else. And when I say integrate, I'm not only talking about the technology side, I'm also talking about the business processes and the business systems that let those restaurants operate, physically. So as things are complex and as there's different integration points and as there's different touch points and training, this complexity is just, it can just be overwhelming to get into. And there's so many products out there to try to manage that chaos. And so that, that's definitely one of the big challenges that we're dealing with. David, I'd love to hear your take on that as well.
With any, the bigger the brand, the more complex, just from an integration standpoint, between their HRIS to payroll to, their point of sale systems to their BI systems, even as a technologist in this space, serving many different brands, it becomes we have to architect how we're going to integrate and how we're going to work with a brand and being able to pull that data. So there's a lot of touch points, which also create a lot of complexity and could even result in problematic issues down the line when these products aren't working independent with each other. So, that I would say, compared to 10 years ago, we really had to bring in the right resources that can help, technologists, the IT leaders manage some of those specific integrations. As we look at those integrations, we also realize that, based on some of the HT tech studies, that while there's, I would say about 2.6% of all revenue is invested back in technology, about 70% is maintaining current systems. The maintaining current systems, as we've asked many of our customers, are really in the bucket of, well, I have products that I have to integrate and manage and support those integrations, whether it's through the third party or themselves, which, cost resources and additional IT team members, but also think about 30 to 40 different IT partners. You have 30 to 40 IT partners that have to be managed by an IT team as well. because they're an extension of that IT team. So, it is daunting where it's going, and I could see, why many CEOs and CFOs are shaking their head when somebody says they want another technology, because the cost in some cases, as I've heard from one CEO, for their technology, it has become higher than their lease on a monthly basis from some of their restaurants. With that, I focus on, and my team focuses on ensuring the manager has the greatest experience by leveraging our technology. And, go ahead, Fred.
And what we're talking about here, all this right here is just the internal operations. Nowadays, with the advent of smartphones, you have a situation where people are now using smartphones to find out where they should go. And of course, we all have learned the hard way that, a good Yelp score helps you a lot and a bad Yelp score hurts you a lot. And so systems like companies like Merchant Centric can help you get some consumer sentiment and identify the problems. And then online ordering with companies like Monkey Group or Olo that can help a restaurant company communicate with their customers. But this is a great example of how we as consumers use our smartphone to access different data points that affect our behavior. And what we're talking about here is using technology in the same way, with an easy to use. And this is a good example of push technology versus pull technology, what we're trying to do. And that's part of what this whole webinar is about, is to help you understand in a way you can relate to a holistic manner of how you approach your business in an intelligent way holistically. So at the end of the day, you're more profitable, you deliver a better guest experience, and you win the game, because it's a very, very competitive environment. David, why don't you comment a little bit about how we can begin to handle all this data we're getting from all these different applications?
Yeah, I think that the goal is, in order to have that experience that we all have with our smartphones, it just works, and it helps you manage the day-to-day even when the unexpected occurs. As an example, Waze directs us in to different routes when something happens that is going to prevent us from being on time. The reality in all of this is companies need a data strategy. We do work with a lot of brands, and they are just managing the chaos of trying to integrate these systems. But we're seeing a lot of the innovative brands focus on having a data strategy. And with that data strategy, it's really, as you think about going from raw data where we're pulling from the point of sale or another system, it's aggregating that data and making it more accessible to app data. App data goes from a pull that we're getting from systems like the point of sale to a push to where it starts to create actionable insights. So that's our focus, with Clarify, and ensuring that we get to insights that help managers make great decisions. Because we all know, no matter how seasoned a manager is, they have a lot of blind spots. There are a lot of moving parts in the change of a shift that can be impacted by weather conditions, or it can be impacted by a sporting event, positively or negatively. But there are also, things that they may not be aware of, like temperature cooler systems going down. That these certain thresholds have to be communicated as they're running their day-to-day. So when we look at this, it's not just a matter of just adding technology. It's really having a complete strategy to understand how these systems will become interdependent with each other.
No, that's a good point, because as we showed you on this graphic here, the amount of data that's being generated by all these functions is enormous. And the person who can capture that data and turn it into actionable knowledge and intelligence is the one that's going to win the battle here and make it a lot easier for people to operate.
Just as we think about the architecture at a high level, seamless integration across products was our focus, to where, same look, same feel, one ID, one password. Mobile apps also was a focus. We know that managers don't want to be in the office, but 30 to 40 systems to where, they may not have tablets, or they may not be allowed to use their smartphones. Our focus was working with innovative brands that provided the technology to their managers to stay out of the office. Going back to what managers love to do and not what they need to do, couldn't you have both? Couldn't you allow them to continue to be up in front of the house and only go to the back of the house when necessary, when, you know, something was alerting them? That was our focus, to keep them at front of the house, touching tables, ensuring the right guest experiences, coaching and developing their staff, as opposed to being tethered to a back office computer. It also needed to be interruptive, meaning I need to know when something's occurring, like overtime, or if somebody didn't show up. So we wanted to make sure that it was pushing, and then an offline capability to where if they were not in a place where they can get cellular or Wi-Fi, like a cooler or freezer, while they're doing their counts for inventory, we wanted to make sure that it was essential to have offline capabilities. So we broke it up into product people and operations specific to the products. We wanted to ensure that it had the connectivity, you know, to allow the integrations of third-party applications and all the development kits to be able to integrate off of your various systems, and then a strong foundation for that workflow and reporting. And that was really the backbone of what brought Clarify together for us. And, you know, as we continue to forge this path, our goal is to ensure that managers stay on the floor and they're only communicated things that they need to be aware of and take charge to.
No, this is a great explanation of what you've done. And as I mentioned, with the Internet of Things, it's going to generate that much more information. So this is going to just become more and more important as we go forward. It's not going to get easier. It's going to get more complex.
It is. Our focus on this, you know, going back to it, is like the day-to-day. What do I need to do? What's my objectives? What are my KPIs that I'm measured against? Where do I stand against those KPIs? Am I on track? Am I not? My exercise was a manager walking in the door, and I would ask him to go review the clipboard on the sales and the labor and the comps, and determine where we were at. That way it presented some level of focus for the day on whether I was going to drive sales, or, you know, we always say they want to drive sales, or focus on, you know, cutting labor because we knew that we were off. So, you know, as you think about, you know, the capability of, you know, pulling these disparate systems together and having them more interdependent, that will obviously ensure that the manager is getting back to the things that they love most, and hopefully it will limit that complexity that we're seeing today in these
that's been great feedback. And of course, now as you move forward to the future with robotics, artificial intelligence, voice as a means for people to interact with us, it's going to get more interesting. I think restaurants in 3 or 5 years is going to be dramatically different than they are today. Even in QSR, all the big boys will have kiosks in every location within 3 years. That's just a given, because with minimum wage going up to $15 an hour, the cost for doing this now, you know, for an employee at $15 an hour is $30,000 a year, and that's what a robot costs, or a kiosk is even less than that. So it's important. So to wrap this things up, hopefully you begin to see now the systems are important in your organization, but you're understanding them interdependently. And of course, for your staff people, it's really important for them to understand what everybody else does, because they can't just operate in a vacuum. The starting point for that is to look at systems that are failing. You know, is it because the results aren't there? We have a tendency to blame people for problems. Sometimes it's the system, and that's the great realization in reading Peter Senge's book, The Fifth Discipline, is understanding that systems drive behavior. And if you're not getting the results you want, look at the system first, then the person, not the person first and then the system. And as David pointed out, as you're growing your business and the business needs to get more complex and there's turnover, if you have a system that can sort of prompt you and guide you, it'll help you fulfill those things even with a new person on board. So defining the existing workflow process and some of the examples we gave you, and then figuring out what the future workflow process is. And the nice thing about technology is it eliminates redundancy and repetitive tasks that are boring and don't stimulate somebody. So not only will you get better productivity, but you'll have more time for people to focus on the things that matter the most. And then lastly is to select technology systems and implement those processes to improve it in a holistic manner. And so when we work with clients, we're able to do that in a different way. So there was a question asked by one of the participants about whether or not, for corporate purposes, can you budget food and beverage costs with Clarify? David?
If you can budget food and
labor costs with Clarify. Is there a budgeting feature built into Clarify, or is Clarify more of a reporting tool?
No, it's everything is driven by a budget specific to that. So, I mean, getting to a budget for your labor, getting to a budget for your food cost, all of that is capable through Clarify.
Great. Let's see if we have any more questions. The other question is to just, how do we better understand, you know, the various functions that we're talking about here in this discussion. You will get a copy of this webinar, and you'll be able to see the diagrams you've shown here. This one specifically is what's being asked about. And what we do as an organization in helping our clients is that we help them by accessing what is going on in these various functions and how are they able to be improved, how can technology be automated, how do people better understand their roles, and then we help them understand the cross-functional process based on different meetings they may have and different things they're trying to achieve. But I want to thank everyone for participating today and look forward to seeing you on our next webinar, which we'll be announcing shortly. David, thank you so much for your participation, and it looks like Clarify really solves a lot of the complexity and the problems here. And Alex, thank you as well for participating and enjoying today's discussion.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you, Fred.